Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodity space. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest focuses on the global economy, geopolitics, and the metals industry with a big focus on China starting in 1993. He is the founder of Simon Hunt Strategic Services. You can reach him at simon-hunt.com. Very excited to welcome Simon Hunt back to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, appreciate you coming back on. I want to start with a tweet you made recently where you said the S&P should reach around 5,900 and copper about 11,500. The latter having nothing to do with EVs, renewables, and data centers, but to the demands of war and the unfolding inflationary scenario. So talk to us about what you're seeing up ahead for the S&P and copper and how war and inflation will drive the copper price higher, because these aren't things often people discuss: the electrification of the world, the emergence of a new middle class in developing nations, etc. So talk to us about war and inflation and its effect on copper.
Well, I think we have to start with a huge proviso, and that is that no war, either in Europe or the Middle East, breaks out before early next year. The problem is that the dots are so lining up that the war in Europe can very easily spill over Ukraine's borders into other countries as NATO, ACA, Washington, and London have already made decisions. So we hear, in fact, back in second half of 2023, that an attack will be launched on Russia. So if that, and then if you look at what's happening in Israel, there are these rumors going around that Netanyahu has asked his defense secretary, his defense minister, to resign because he does not support a larger war against Hezbollah. And that the likely replacements, there are two of them, I forget their names, both would support such a war. The issue, one of the many issues, should that happen, is that there is only a 2 to 3 week time frame when the Air Force would be able to support any ground invasion because of weather conditions. So I made that comment before appreciating fully that the risk of war is very imminent. So if war does break out, you can forget that forecast, because immediately, with a global economy that's pretty fragile, it would sink quickly. Equity markets would correct very sharply. Metal prices will fall sharply, and the whole world will be in disarray. And in a war scenario like that, rightly or wrongly, the dollar would rise sharply. So all of the war changes upside down the economic and financial structure. So if there is no such escalation of the conflicts, then markets will be driven higher, rightly or wrongly, by the Fed and other central banks cutting rates. Although one has to add that in nearly every case, when rates start to be cut, they're cut because the economy is in recession or is about to fall into recession. So that's how we start. Frankly, the driving force in everything is geopolitics. And you have to ask the question, why is Washington and London so intent on attacking Russia and containing China? It's really because those two countries are the leading members of BRICS and SCO, Shanghai Cooperative Organization. And Washington, having at first dismissed BRICS as being anything of significance, now understands fully that if the BRICS summit is allowed to take place in October, when there will be a number of announcements made that will show how mature BRICS has become, and that they are accelerating their development of their own unit currency, which will be based on, as we understand it, 40% gold, 60% member currencies, but those member currencies linked back into gold. That would be a big stab into America and its allies.
Hey guys, just a quick break to hear from today's sponsor, ARC Silver Gold Osmium. They offer personalized service and competitive prices with no minimum purchase for silver, gold, platinum, or osmium. Here's just some of the comments left on this YouTube channel about ARC SGO and owner Ian Everard. Have bought from ARC, good source and price. I cannot say enough good about Ian and his company. He is the most honest individual I could find in order to buy precious metals. If you are looking to buy precious metals, I recommend Ian at ARC Silver. He is a straight shooter. So go to arcsgo.com and contact Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com. And make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. And so the trend of de-dollarization has been a topic that has been discussed a lot in recent times, including what you're mentioning about the BRICS creating their own sort of currency unit. However, there are a lot to point, Brent Johnson being one of them. There's several people that point to the fact that the US dollar is certainly not going to lose its status as reserve currency in the next decade at least. It could take much, much longer. Do you think that it could actually be accelerating faster than most anticipate with this BRICS meeting and their potential announcement of this currency unit?
Well, I can't answer if you mean, will it accelerate faster than most are thinking, because I don't know who the most are. But I think that it is on track to be a serious rival to the US dollar within 2 years.
I believe that is faster than most are anticipating, so absolutely answered the question there. I do want to hone in on gold. You mentioned it being part of the backing for this new currency, continuing to reach all-time highs, at least in nominal terms. Is gold signaling that the Fed is going to cut rates up ahead? I believe most market participants are expecting a 25 to 50 basis point, some are even saying 75 basis point cut up ahead. Is that the main reason that gold is climbing here? What are the other factors? Do you see other factors as well driving the gold price?
I think gold's rise is much less to do with the Fed cutting rates and much more a reflection of geopolitical tensions. And it's not just central banks that are adding to their gold reserves for this reason, but increasingly financial institutions. And it's the power of gold buying has been outside the OECD countries, well, outside the G20 countries. Middle East, Asia, Russia, China. Don't forget that China's public owns something around 25,000 tons of gold. And Chinese ministries, not just the central bank, but mostly the PLA, own something around another 25,000 tons. And I mean, in the last 6 months, the Chinese government has encouraged its citizens to buy gold by providing a platform that allows them from their bank accounts to buy physical gold from the Shanghai Gold Exchange, even on a never-never basis. So, I mean, my guess, and it's probably tied into the new BRICS currency, which I believe is called the unit, the currency unit, that China will announce within 2 years that their currency is supported by the gold which its citizens own. And I think they'll give out the figure. What does that do to the dollar? And also, Russia owns much more than is publicized. It's probably north of 12,000 tons.
Some fascinating developments, to be sure. I would also like to get your thoughts on silver breaking and staying above 30 for the time being. A lot of people are expecting that to perhaps fall back below again. Many people point to paper manipulation of both the gold and silver markets as a big factor in the way that it's currently priced. I'm wondering, do you see the same drivers in play for silver as for gold at the moment? Do you think industrial demand will play a role?
I don't follow silver as closely as I follow gold, but talking to my friends, I think that silver over a year is likely to grow faster than gold. I would call silver is the trading account, but gold is your wealth account.
So last time you were on the show, you warned about potential cyber attacks, and that seems to be playing out. We've now seen a hacking group claim to have stolen personal records of 2.9 billion people, including social security numbers, back in April. Major airlines having to ground flights in July due to a supposed global IT crash, and Germany blaming Russia for cyber attacks against the EU and NATO a few weeks ago. Now, as always, the media likely isn't giving us the full story. I'm wondering what your thoughts are here on these developments.
Well, I think that, what's that American company called? Counter-Strike, that's right, Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike, so I believe, has had close ties with intelligence agencies, and that is where the fault lines lay. I suspect, from what I gather, that it was a dress rehearsal. Check out the weaknesses in the system. And it's quite possible that before the election in America, there will be a cyber attack that shuts down all the computers, etc., etc., etc. Not undertaken by Russia or China.
But of course, you expect it to be blamed on Russia or China at that point in time, right?
Everything is blamed on Russia that can be.
Yeah. So ultimately, it feels like they do not want Donald Trump to be able to actually make it, as we have seen a second assassination attempt. This isn't, I'm not on one side or the other politically, but obviously this is a cause for grave concern where one of the people who could potentially, one of the presidential candidates, has now had an attempt, very direct attempt on his life once, and another one that was in the making and nearly came to fruition. What exactly is going on here? Is this cyber attack kind of that you see coming perhaps the next step, another way for them to stop this election from actually taking place?
I think I'll answer that question slightly differently. I think the powers behind the throne will use everything and anything to prevent Donald Trump from getting into the White House. Because if he does, and probably having RFK as his Attorney General, all of these, whatever you like to call them, neocons, deep state guys, around 5,000 of them in Washington, will be all out on their ears. And that will be the end of their decades-long dream of global domination, dismembering Russia, containing China. Some even say that dismembering Russia is only a step to the ultimate goal of breaking up China.
And we are,
so
yeah, go ahead.
They're desperate times require desperate measures.
So how far do you think they'll go to achieve their ends? And ultimately, could this not result in civil unrest in the United States? I've spoken to Martin Armstrong. He believes we'll eventually actually see a civil war in America, and America eventually break up into different countries sometime in the next decade or so. I'm wondering what your thoughts are there. And obviously they're playing a dangerous game here, because there's a risk that there will be uprisings within the American population. Do you see that as a potential scenario?
You can already see it. It's happening already. I think that opinions are so forcibly being expressed by both sides that the likelihood of, whether it's civil war or civil strife, of breaking out is very real. I think the same is true across Europe, and particularly in the UK. I think there is a real risk that we will soon see the army patrolling the streets, and within 2 to 3 years, there will be a national government. The question then is, who runs the national government? But if you've got the army patrolling the streets, it's an easy step forward to say the generals will control the national government, which will probably be a very good thing. But that said, it will, in the immediate future, would cause huge unrest, crisis. Then if you look at Europe, I mean, the European population in Western Europe, every single one of them doesn't want their governments. And then if you look at history, every revolution in Europe has been caused by the peasants, today's farmers. And it's the farmers who've started the rebelling against not just their own government, but against Brussels. So add on to that the fragile financial situation in Europe, the level of debt, etc. War is one way out.
So why would military generals calling the shots in the UK be a good thing in your view?
Who else is going to call the shots in a national government? Who are the strong people? I'm not saying the generals will be. I'm merely saying you've got to have people like that. And if the army is patrolling the streets, it's not such a big stretch to think it would be the generals.
Now, I want to continue down this path in the UK, because we have seen quite what many would call Orwellian attack on free speech, not only in the UK, but in other places of the world. But the UK police are throwing people in jail for social media posts. They're even threatening people overseas that we're going to extradite you and put you in jail if you say something we don't like. How did we get here? And how does this all play out?
I think we have to come back to the basic theme in all of this, is that the powers behind nearly all governments in the Western world stem from the Davos crowd. And these guys do not want the wrong story to be put out. And social media has been an avenue that they have not been able to control because it's been outside what they've been used to. But now the real information is getting out. They're getting desperate. And it's across the Western world.
So do you think we will eventually see a point in time where more of these so-called thought crimes start getting persecuted? I believe Hillary Clinton came out recently and said people need to start being punished for spreading misinformation online. Obviously, this has been a big mandate of the EU. We're going to put an end to misinformation, disinformation on the internet. They've threatened X and Elon Musk several times that he better comply with their regulations, or they're going to shut down X in Europe. We've already seen X get shut down in Brazil. Not only shut down, but citizens are now threatened with a $9,000 fine if they use a VPN to access X because they just want to check their posts or whatever, which seems completely crazy. It seems like things are headed more and more in that direction. Is there a light at the end of this tunnel, or do you just expect more darkness ahead?
I think the only light comes after the big crisis. I think we need the big crisis to cleanse the whole system.
And how do you see this big crisis playing out?
It's a crisis within governments and between governments. So it's, put bluntly, it's America and its allies versus Russia and China. But I think it's quite interesting from what I'm picking up that India and China have started to mend their fences over the border dispute, and that Modi wants strong ties between India, Russia, and China, whilst trying to keep a relationship with America. But basically, I think the focus is to have these very strong ties between Russia and China, which will give added strength to the BRICS group of nations.
So you're seeing this shift where the center of power lies from being focused on the West, particularly America, with its hegemony, its essential control of NATO, etc., moving towards a more multipolar world where we have this BRICS alliance that's offering a counterpoint. There's some who would bring up the fact that, well, do we really want countries like Russia and China calling the shots? Obviously, there's a lot of misinformation, to bring that term back up again, in the mainstream media, where they like to demonize Russia, they like to demonize China, and say, well, they're dictatorships, how could we trust them? The world would go into chaos, democracy would be lost, on and on and on, all while ignoring all of the violations of democracy committed by the West. I'm wondering what your response is to that, and how people are perceiving that Russia and China are the bad guys, and so we don't want them in charge.
I jokingly say, but I suspect there's an element of truth in it, that the media every evening or night gets a missive from the CIA and MI6. These are your stories for tomorrow. That's basically it. You control the media.
We are seeing that more and more in Western nations. Canada, where I'm from, the media is completely controlled and funded by the government, which obviously is a massive problem. It seems like when it comes to free speech, personal sovereignty, all of these things, freedom of movement, there isn't, the architects, what I mean by that are governments, nonprofit organizations, big corporations, Google, essentially in many ways controls the internet. They're all aligned. And so how can we expect the tide to turn? you're saying it's going to require a crisis, I believe.
Yeah, everything that I put together, it has to be a crisis to cleanse the system.
Well, talk to us about what you're seeing in that crisis. How do you see it unfolding? Nobody has a crystal ball here, but what do you see as likely? Do you ascribe to the fact that we're going to see civil wars, as Martin Armstrong has said, and perhaps the breaking up of nations? Do you think the EU will be able to continue to survive over the course of the next decade? How do you see all this playing out?
Well, I think Martin Armstrong is dead right. War comes back to the point I made earlier, that America and her allies are not going to allow BRICS to mature into a real rival to their system. That's the bottom line. And that inevitably means war. Either the war is very soon, as we discussed earlier, or it will happen in a year or two's time. So if it gets postponed for whatever reason, then I think that the global economy is tipping over. By early next year, most countries will be in recession. Then all the central banks and governments will be throwing everything into the pie to stop a systemic failure. So inflation takes off, dollar falls sharply, and inflation takes off to an extent that it will probably exceed what we experienced, or some of us did, in the second half of the 70s and early 80s, 1981 being the peak in inflation. So you'll be seeing US inflation 13% plus, global inflation 15% plus. And what does that do for the bond vigilantes? Central banks don't control the long end of the curve. We will see US 10-year treasuries yielding over 10%. What does that do to a highly indebted world? End of story. So if war is postponed until after that happens, which will be when we 25, 26, end 26, early 27, then you will then have either rolling recessions or depression plus war. But my fear is that war is going to happen before Inauguration Day in America in January.
So in this scenario you've outlined, rising inflation, you said similar to what was happening in the 70s. How do you expect commodities to perform in that environment? Stepping outside of the monetary metals, looking at things like copper, looking at things like the energy space, oil and gas, uranium, etc., all of those things. Would that type of global recession, depression, crush demand enough that we wouldn't see growth there, or is it more complicated than that?
It's much more complicated because you have to put in the war scenario. So let us assume no big escalation to the current conflicts at this stage. So we will probably see markets getting excited by central banks cutting interest rates. And we will see S&P rising sharply into the early months of next year, with base metal prices like copper rising to potentially over $11,000. But it is then that the real recession will start hitting. And then we will have big falls in equity markets and in base metal markets to the end of 2025. Then more liquidity is driven into the system, and you have the final hurrah, as I'd like to call it, when you have a takeoff in equity markets and takeoff in base metal markets, with copper potentially going to 14,000, and S&P over 7,000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then we come back to what I've just said, the bond vigilantes. But the alternative scenario, which I mostly fear, which is the war scenario breaking out by the end of this year, that all changes the equation.
How does that change the equation, the war scenario?
Because the world goes into not the depression in 2028, but almost immediately.
And so for your average person listening to this who has the same concerns as you, what's the best way to try to safeguard one's wealth? Obviously, we discussed last time storing food. That's one thing that you brought up that I think is very pertinent, that not enough people think about. Storing food, drinkable water, all of those things. But when it comes to protecting wealth in this scenario, is physical gold the best way to do this? Are there other strategies? What are your thoughts?
Physical gold, number one. Well, first of all, to survive, you need food and water. There are some very good generating sets, particularly produced in China, powered by folding solar panels, from which you can run everything: electricity, heating, blah, blah, blah. That's the first thing. Water, too, is essential. And then in terms of food, to have enough food, either in your fridges or in your garden, that you can survive on. So always keep your deep freezers full. In terms of your assets, gold, number one. Physical things. So physical things mean your house, land. There's the story of the old Italian family going back centuries, and I forget which one it is. Wars were a common theme in those days. They had title to their lands, so they left in their wagons. What did they carry? Gold and art. So when the wars ended, they came back, they had their gold, they had their art, and they had title to their lands. So I think that's the sort of thing one needs to think about.
Interesting. I had not heard art being part of the conversation before. So any sort of collectible, this type of tangible asset that could hold its value over time.
Anything physical. Because I think, there's a close friend of mine who knows Africa very well, traveled all over the place. He said, I never carried cash with me. I carried physical things because it's a barter system. Even today, he's buying X, Y, and Z from Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, etc., etc., etc. No cash, physical.
Very interesting. So you could see a sort of barter system emerge if we get this global war.
Yeah. So, anything physical.
Well, Simon, this has been a fantastic conversation. Greatly appreciate you coming on the show, as always. For those who want to learn more, tell us about Simon Hunt Strategic Services. You got the website simon-hunt.com. People can head there. Talk to us about what it is you do there.
I do my best to put, thanks to a group of associates who are pretty well informed, we put together the geopolitical dots, the economic dots, and the copper dots. How do they all fit together? And this is how we come to our conclusions. And we're probably writing 2-3 times a week. There's so much going on. You have to produce things on a very timely and regular basis. In fact, my chat with you has interrupted what I'm doing at the moment.
Great. Well, I'm going to put a link in the description below to Simon Hunt Strategic Services for people who want to check that out. Thank you once again, Simon, for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, this episode is brought to you by ARC Silver, Gold, Osmium for all your precious metals needs. Head to arcsgo.com and contact owner Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.